note that.
Understood.
So if you're ready to begin, Chris, I'm actually going to take the reins. I don't have anything to share as far as a screenshot here, but there was a couple items that I wanted to talk with the commission here on the front end, and some of them, Chairman Teske, we might want to put a pause on, if you will, without having a more robust attendance here, but I'll certainly dip our toe in and share some of the updates I've got for you all. So the first one I wanted to share with you all is really an update on the comprehensive plan. I think you all were aware that City Council had adopted that plan back on the 16th, and we had originally scheduled to take the plan to the Mesa County Planning Commission on the 17th, but due to the change made to the kind of Appleton North area of the plan, the county received a huge quantity of comments not in support of that change, and so they had tabled the hearing on that. Ultimately, that hearing had been rescheduled for the February 18th meeting of theirs, again, Mesa County Planning Commission. They had received, I believe, over 100 comments in total about that change. They heard it on the 18th, and again, they're really just considering the land use plan portion of the comprehensive plan. At that hearing, they actually received testimony that one of the significant tracts of acreage, about half of that acreage that had been previously represented by Appleton Properties, had actually been transferred to the new owners, Bob and Anna Marie Fuco. And the Fucos then provided testimony that they were not interested in that change council had made to residential low, but were asking for residential rural. So the Mesa County Planning Commission adopted a different map than what was adopted here at the City Council. And as a result, we actually took that request for change back to our City Council just last night. And our City Council did support that change from that Mesa County had approved, which is a really good thing to say. At the end of the day, we now have adopted maps, the same maps between Mesa County Planning Commission and ours here at the city. So happy to report that that was the outcome. I've heard multiple times through my career, if you don't like what your neighbor is doing, to buy the property. And I've seen it actually come to fruition very few times, but that's certainly what occurred here and has made for a nice resolve to some of those matters. So he said, pleased to, I guess, announce that I think that planning process has concluded, which is great. And we have a very active plan and planning document to work from as we look forward. So I'll pause there, see if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next update. So the next update that I just wanted to discuss briefly is just a update on the vacancy that we had from the resignation of Commissioner Kim Kirk. And just wanted to report that our city clerk is the one that is tasked here at the county, or sorry, Wow City, with filling those positions, and they are seeking recruitments from our city council right now for participation in an interview team, and I believe have begun advertising for that vacancy as well. So hopefully we'll find some great candidates, and city council will then make that appointment. It's not scheduled yet, but certainly we'll keep you apprised of when we can expect a new member of your commission. Let me pause there, see if anybody wants to add anything.
Well, just a question. Since we have two, does Andrea become then a sitting commissioner, and then the alternatives? I was trying to remember the name. I would say the JV team. Does the JV team move up?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. You know, it's actually pretty interesting how it's written in our code. It actually says explicitly what you just indicated, is that the alternates move up a seat. So Andrea, as the first alternate, would move into the regular position, a regular member position. It does require the city to make that appointment to make it so, but that certainly is the outcome that I have seen, and certainly that's the code, or as the code is written, but they do actually need to make that appointment to make that happen. And they would do that at the same time that they consider the appointment for the new fill of the position as well, or fill of the vacancy. So then, Sandra, that would mean that you would likely also get moved up one step closer to the varsity team, if you will. So you'd move to that first alternate seat is generally how that assignment goes.
Chairman Teskey and Community Development Director Tamara, just for planning purposes, I want to reiterate my intention is to, my term is up in October, and my intention is I could go for another term, but I am not going to. I'm going to be 70 years old, and I know that's the new young, especially to Sam Sestras. But I've been honored to serve 7 years on this commission, and I think we have a great planning department. And Chairman Teskey, I appreciate what you do, and but I am going to go retire. I'm going to be a planning commissioner emeritus.
That sounds great. We should adopt an official position for you.
Well, Christian, I think, is term limited and going to be leaving too. So the two of us will go out together. How's that?
Commissioner Gassis, thank you for that. Yeah, I thought this is what people did in the retirement, so I guess I'm really confused. That said, I did want to note that it's not just George. George is obviously, you've expressed, I think, before, actually late last fall, that you weren't interested in serving another term. Christian is also term limited, but we have several other positions available. So as we get closer to the date, probably late summer, we will start soliciting. And again, this is done through the clerk's office, but start soliciting to you all on whether you want to serve another term or if there will be a vacancy or expected vacancy to fill. So just so you know, Ken Scissors' term is up on this year. Sam Sessuris's term is up. Chairman Teskey, your term is up this year. So we have lots of vacancies or potential for transition. But hopefully some of you will choose to put your name back in the hat and consider serving another term for us here. Great, thank you for that conversation. I did want to also, as we're moving through a couple of punch list items here for me, wanted to talk a little bit about next Tuesday's agenda, specifically the access control plan. This item obviously was heard 2 meetings ago, and the request at that point in time was to continue for another 30 days to seek some additional input. We've actually done a very significant amount of outreach and engagement, certainly through our Chamber of Commerce here, amongst other entities and organizations. And we continue to meet and schedule meetings. We actually, our Public Works Director just last night met with a significant HOA, and we're continuing to field questions. So just wanted to let you know that from a staff's perspective here, both from myself as a director and from Trent Paul, we will be requesting on Tuesday that we actually table the access control plan until we feel like we're in a good place, that we have had the conversations with the neighbors and some of the business owners in that corridor to be comfortable in bringing that back to you all for consideration. So just wanted to preview that, give you a heads up. It's a legislative issue, so wanted to let you know that that is what we're doing, and that will certainly be our request on Tuesday.
Well, we appreciate the heads up.
Yeah. And then the last one, and Chairman Teskey will look maybe a bit to you, is just maybe a brief conversation about our virtual meetings and our virtual workshops. We certainly are seeing the county start to open up again, and you probably saw the headline, I think it was in yesterday's newspaper, about the county requesting that Mesa County be open in full by approximately mid-April. I know that's ongoing conversations between Mesa County Public Health and the governor here of the state on whether that will be allowed, but we're certainly starting to anticipate, obviously, the easing up. For example, City Hall will be open up regular 5 days a week, 9 hours a day, starting on Monday. So we're already seeing that transition here for our organization. There was a conversation as recent as last night with our city council about when they will be inviting public back into their auditorium. And just so you guys know, they have been continuing to meet in a hybrid fashion. Some council members have been online and some have been in the auditorium. Similarly, some staff has been online and some has been in the auditorium, but have not at this point re-invited the public or applicants to attend in person. I'm certainly tracking that and would expect for this planning commission to likely follow suit on whatever the decision is from city council. I know they're waiting to see what happens in that conversation between public health and the governor on whether we'll be allowed to open up without any restrictions. And I suspect that should they get the green light to do so, we will be seeing our council chambers open back up for public hearings. So that's the hearing part. There's then the workshop portion, and really would actually defer to you guys. I think probably the first threshold is understanding what our public hearing setting is going to look like, but really look to you all to understand at what point or points along the spectrum might you be ready to meet back in person again. So don't necessarily need to come specifically to conclusion today, but thought I would put it out there in case anyone wanted to share some thoughts.
I sit on a couple of other boards also, and I originally did not enjoy Zoom meetings, and now I'm finding that it's allowing me to attend more meetings and more of other kind of workshops. I would love if we could have an opportunity for just the workshops to still have some component of a virtual attendance. And I think it would help, I don't know, other potential commissioners coming up if you didn't have to make that time commitment to drive down to City Hall, you know, that every other week when we weren't having to meet the commission meetings.
I agree. I agree. Certainly with Sandra, and I think the workshops on Zoom have worked out pretty well. And I'm certainly looking forward to opening up the public hearings. I think that would be a wise thing to do, and probably Chairman Teskey would want to hear your thoughts, but probably follow what City Council is going to do.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think we are eager to get back to public hearings where the public is participating in person. That certainly gives a certain level of engagement with community members that we don't get online. We've been pretty successful, I think, with our GJ Speaks platform and working through our online, go-to webinar format for obtaining public comment. And we've had some fairly robust public comments, specifically recently on the ACP plan for Patterson, though we seem to get less overall participation through that means publicly than we do with live meetings. And so to the extent that the City Hall facility will be open to the public and people be able to attend, then I think at least I'd anticipate reopening those proceedings to have them in person to the extent that can be done, obviously safely and consistently with public health guidance, whatever that is at the time. Sounds like that may change relatively quickly here, and perhaps even by our first meeting in April, we'd have some fairly significant changes in the ability to conduct that meeting in person.
Yes, Chairman Teskey, I think that's certainly plausible. We're not sure what that outcome is going to look like, but I do expect over the next 2 to 4 weeks it will change. So I'm happy to put this on our next workshop agenda and talk a little bit more. We will certainly know as the situation continues to evolve. So just wanted to, again, get us thinking about that and preparing for when that time will be. So appreciate the conversation. And at this point, unless there's any other questions on that, item, I would like to shift the presentation to Chris Ashbeck here, a principal planner in our department. And I believe the Lincoln Park Historic Guidelines is the first item on the agenda.
Are you seeing a presentation? No?
No,
No?
no.
Okay. Not sure what I need to do different here. No,
I think your IT support is headed your direction.
I think she is. I hear her footsteps. I need to get that one over there. No. Oh yeah, I forgot this one. No, you're good. Thank you. All right, now you're seeing a presentation?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, we just wanted to workshop a couple of items that are actually on your agenda for next week. And this one in particular, the Planning Commission, other than this, of adopting a code, an amendment, basically, the Planning Commission has very little involvement in historic preservation. The Historic Preservation Board is tasked with hearing these sorts of items that will come out of this proposal, and they are doing that already for the North 7th Street Historic District. So, but this part of it is to adopt a new part of the code. The Lincoln Park Historic District has developed these themselves. The neighbors that live within there have worked on these for probably about 2 years now. And so they're excited to bring them forward to be adopted into the code. The district is at, you might have seen these signs that exist out there. The district is at 12th and Grand to Gunnison, and then 12th to 15th. Originally, I think back in 1997, only in the 4-block area between 12th and 14th and Gunnison and Uray were formed as a district. But in 2018, it was expanded by 5 more blocks to include approximately 110 properties, including a historic school there on 15th, between 14th and 15th on Gunnison. So the code does provide, though, that when a district is designated, they have the opportunity to adopt design guidelines and standards for their district to be applied to all the properties within the district. So that is the step that this district has chosen to take. The guidelines and standards themselves are pretty much, they're based in what is it about this neighborhood that the neighbors want to preserve, want to protect, want to enhance. And this neighborhood is a very 1920s, turn of the century to 1920s. It reflects the expansion of our city from the original square mile that was north to south and 1st to 12th. It reflects the that growth, kind of the next step of growth of just beyond, just east of that square mile. But it continues a lot of the downtown things that we know about, the park strips, the setbacks, the large lawns, the tree-lined streets, how there are detached garages in the back, and all those character elements of what makes this attractive. And those are the kinds of things that these guidelines and standards, at least for the overall district, are trying to protect. There are also guidelines and standards that address certain elements of the structures themselves, though, looking at porches, window patterns, again, the detached structures in the back. There's a very consistent pattern out there already, even though the styles of the houses are somewhat similar. There's an overall character developed of what it looks like out there. And so the guidelines and standards are also specific to those sorts of elements. And they do, the important ones that they think are mostly just, they are just exterior. They don't address anything about what you can do with the interior of the home, but they do address things like the peaked roofs and the materials on the exterior, the pattern of the windows, the pattern of brick, that sort of thing, and then the importance of their porches. But they don't address anything about having to, do any kind of review for anything that happens on the interior of the structure. So these are the standards, or the things that they are addressing in their standards. And I wasn't really going to cover each standard item by item of how they read or what they say, but these are the areas that they felt were important. And the standards versus guidelines, standards are considered required. And then guidelines are things that are just recommendations or suggestions. So the standards, these are the ones that they're looking at for the overall character, to maintain the character of the overall feel of the neighborhood. So it involves setbacks, compatibility in site design for if there is new construction, keeping the orientation of the streets to the grid system, or the structures to the grid system, of looking at lot coverage by structures so that there isn't, or there aren't a lot of structure covering a site, the lot size, building proportions, and the mass and the form, and the alignment and spacing of structures. And those two, this example here is it on Main Street, I think, of some new units downtown that have been constructed. And this neighborhood is really supportive of this type of development, that even though it isn't the same type of development, there's enough modulation in the window patterns and things like that still make it consistent with the older style of development. So the standards in these areas are trying to address some of those things to make sure that new construction or additions would still be consistent with these sorts of things. And then the more specific ones to the buildings, there are standards that address where an entrance should be to a home, or maintained in a home, or constructed in a new one, what the exterior materials should be, the windows, trim, and architectural details, and trying to keep the patterns of windows similar to what they are now. They're sort of these bands of bands of horizontal windows, and both first and second floor, and trying to, so they got the standards address, trying to maintain that sort of thing as you make modifications to your home. Another area they're concerned about is manufactured homes and modular homes and what those look like. They want to make sure that they don't have just a blank end of a wall facing the street, that they still have the entrance facing a street. And the guidelines and standards just that you'll see in the ordinance, they have a lot of pictures that illustrate the kinds of things to the neighborhood of what's proposed, what's allowable, what's not allowable, to try to draw the line as best they can in some of these areas. And then there is a whole section about demolition of primary structures, anything over 500 square feet of demolition, not including interior, but would require that it go to the Historic Preservation Board to make a recommendation to City Council. There's no requirement for demolition of an accessory structure, only of the primary structures. So most of these standards are very similar to what we are already implementing for the North 7th Street Historic District. They are not quite as strict because North 7th Street is a National Register district and Lincoln Park is a local district. So there's a little bit of distinction there. But they, so early on when the neighborhood met and talked about these, they decided that there was just some things that they didn't want to touch as far as requiring that people do things a certain way. So they made these areas guidelines only, which I said are suggestions or recommendation. And the areas that they're addressing in their guidelines are these: fences, streetscape, and front porches. And just trying to recommend to people that they keep the streetscape looking similar to it does now with the large street trees, possibly some planting, extra plantings or grass for sure in the park strips. Fencing, they do have some guidelines about materials, but there are no standards. And then also some guidelines about front porches. If you'll notice, most of these homes out here have at least a couple of steps up to the door, but they can't necessarily require that, but that's a recommendation. But they also are allowing for still people that can't do the steps, that maybe you could still have a raised porch and be able to put in ADA accessibility, and that sort of thing. So the guidelines are like not, they don't cover as big of as wide of an area of the architectural details, but these are some that they felt were still important for people to know about and try to think about as they make modifications to their home. Generally, they, both in the 7th Street District and here, they're not trying to preclude anyone doing something to your home or making alterations to their home, because they're smaller homes. People want to do expansions. People want to do, additions or new garages. And so they're not precluding that. But what the standards and guidelines try to address is how best to do them, possibly to make them still comply with and conform to, be similar to the style of architecture and the feel of the neighborhood that they already have. They did do a number of neighborhood meetings. They feel pretty confident that they have support from the neighbors out there for these. All of the neighbors were provided with copies of this as it went through different iterations. And I think they feel confident that they shouldn't have any, maybe some opposition at Planning Commission meeting next week. But so are there any questions about it? It's an area that, again, you don't really see anything future, but
Chairman.
the historic, pardon?
I'm sorry. I'll let you finish. I do have some questions, Chairman Teskey.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say that the Historic Preservation Board's involvement is as each of this amendment establishes that process, but because it's already established for the North 7th Street District, but anything that's addressed in here with a standard as a requirement, the property owners are required to submit to our department a certificate of appropriateness application. That application is reviewed, not unlike our other development kinds of applications. And then staff does a staff report and makes a recommendation to the Historic Preservation Board. The board makes the final decision on all of those. They can be appealed. Any decisions can be appealed to the council. We have not had that happen yet, but that will be the board sort of takes your role on for these kinds of applications. So George, you said you had a few questions?
Yes, Kristen, thank you for a good presentation. And you probably, since you haven't mentioned it, the answer is probably negative, but some of the things that were substantial down in Denver was, you look at the old Washington Park neighborhood, it had a lot of bungalows, and then the two things that were really popular down there was scrapes and new buildings, and then or pop tops up existing structures. And it looks like, was there any discussion on any of that, or did they get that far? And if this is an irrelevant question, then disregard it.
No, I think they certainly did discuss that at the neighborhood meetings. And like I said, they're not trying to preclude somebody doing new construction, a pop top. They have actually in the guidelines and standards an example of one they feel is appropriately done, and it's just that it sits back. It's not prominent out to the front of the home, it sits back. And so the standards try to address that modulation of an addition. The scraping, about the only thing that is in here is the demolition process. And so someone would have to apply for a certificate of appropriateness for demolition itself. And that is decided by city council, but there are some requirements for the materials they need to provide, the information they need to provide to look at that demolition. And there is actually it's not a fee. It's a I guess it's a penalty. It's a penalty fee for doing a demolition without approval. And I think they're trying to discourage then the demolition by having that fee in there. But that's about the only extent that they've tried to address those things.
Thank you, Kristen. You've answered my questions.
I have a couple of questions. What, how do these guidelines, how do the standards in particular further the community goals towards affordable housing and towards our overall plan for housing? And why is this layer of government necessary here in terms of what's the difference between this and an HOA? Why are we involved here versus other neighborhoods have an HOA that have architectural controls and that sort of thing?
Well, the difference with this is and that was one of the main reasons that somewhat people were opposed to it at first, is they didn't want an HOA. And so this is not an HOA. And but yet the neighbors felt like, and what it can provide to them is a means to maintain the character of their neighborhood. They see a lot of, not a lot, but they've had some new construction occur. And they see as George was saying, what could happen potentially. And they felt they wanted to take this next step to at least provide, it is sort of like an architectural control, but it is not an HOA. The decisions are made by the city versus by the city board versus by, a board of an architectural control committee or an HOA board. So
I'm still unclear, why not an HOA? Why is this a government layer? And why do we use government resources to address what, forgive me if this is trigger words for some, but this feels very special interest. And I'm trying to understand why there's a government layer and government resources being used here for something that elsewhere HOAs take care of. And not to say that that's the best solution either, but why are we here?
Well, I guess to me, this is not unusual. Most communities that have a historic preservation program, this is how it is implemented, is through the government layer. And the neighborhood feels like the government layer offers them some protection because it's not going to be neighbor against neighbor necessarily, like it is in an HOA sometimes, that it is a government layer. And so it's more that they came to the city asking to do this, not the city putting it out there for them. They also were very opposed to, maybe a small thing, but they didn't want HOA fees and HOA dues and HOA management and all of that that goes along with an HOA.
Instead,
What's
all
that?
All of that element then gets transferred to the city and the overall constituent base, rather than just those neighbors that are ultimately trying to make sure that their desire for an area can trump the individuals that may want to come in and employ private property rights. This is a sensitive topic, and if I'm coming across as antagonistic, that is not my intent, but I don't want to get through these meetings without asking what I feel are very important questions, and I don't want to move on from them until I feel like we've thoroughly answered them. If we're adding a government layer to a special interest zone, you're right, we've done it with corridors and things that have broader community goals behind them. And this particular area and these particular sets of guidelines, and then all of the burden of enforcement and control being placed on the city. I'm just wanting to better understand how that serves the community as a whole and the goals that we've established versus just those in that area.
Keith, I join in on this discussion. So Chris and I, to follow Keith's questioning, were there any HOAs in this area?
No,
There were
not
no
in
HOAs.
there are no HOAs,
So-
no.
So I would take it, Keith, and you brought it up, that it would be more of them wanting the city to enforce these standards. That's my impression. One of the things that was interesting where I used to live is we had some neighborhoods that had no HOAs, the older neighborhoods. They had civic associations that were virtually powerless. And then the other area is if the HOAs had problems or concerns, their problem on enforcement is they have to go. The only way an HOA can enforce things is go to district court, which is really expensive, and most of them don't do that. So I would think, Keith, it's more of I think, as Kristen said, they want these standards. That's what they want. And they didn't have an HOA, I guess, and they want the standards to be enforceable. Did I get the gist of that, Kristen?
Yeah, I think so. These older areas, I wouldn't see this sort of thing happening in a subdivision out in the Redlands necessarily, unless it happens to be historic. But these older areas, it's kind of, it's not the only way. They could try to form an HOA, but it's just highly unusual in a subdivision that was created in the 1910s to go backwards and try to do that, formulate an HOA. But this gives them an opportunity to at least have some enforceable design standards. And it does, when going back to, is this supported? There are three parts of the newly adopted comprehensive plan that specifically address historic properties, heritage preservation, and historic preservation education. And this is a way to meet all three of those. And those are community-wide goals. So by doing preservation neighborhood by neighborhood, I think the community as a whole is benefiting. It's not just for benefit of these neighbors. I think the community will benefit as a whole, that it meets those goals of our comprehensive plan.
How many other historic districts are there in the city, in particular adjoining to this area?
There are only two that we have North 7th Street Historic District, and then we have another local district on Rood and Main Street between about 9th and 15th. And they have not.
Has that been newly formed, or has that been?
They, I think, were formed also in 2018, maybe early 2019, but they have not.
Yeah, I think that was the area that the downtown transition was coming into, and they wanted to get more involved there.
That was a lot of it. That picture that I showed earlier, it had somewhat to do with that, but they have not taken this next step of trying to develop any guidelines or standards for that district.
But it sounds like this area, this 2 blocks, or this area, is more for historical purposes rather than the transition element.
Right. But they do have there's a few properties in there that are zoned R5, And so they could potentially have some multifamily development if somebody wanted to. So the guidelines and standards try to address that sort of thing as well, as what if something does get demolished and we build new, or what if the school turns into something else? What do we want it to look like?
Well, I have a question, and I could be totally wrong, so I'm just asking, but I looked at a property in one of the other historic areas, and I was under the impression that those areas were all opt-in, that the property owners had to opt in if they wanted, maybe it was just a historic classification or something, and not that they fell under the historic guidelines in those areas. Is that right? Or do they all fall under them no matter what in the other historic preservation areas?
Well, we only have the North 7th Street Historic District that has guidelines and standards adopted, and then there's this one. For any other properties that may be designated historic, there we have no guidelines and standards.
Maybe that's what it was.
Even our railroad station is a good example. I mean, it's on the National Register of Historic Places, but the city of Grand Junction does not have an overall historic preservation ordinance that requires this sort of thing be applied to all designated properties. So, and we don't have that many. We have about, I think, including this area, a couple hundred historic designated structures, but there are a lot of homes that certainly aren't historic, which is 50 years or older. So these days, that's all the homes, even up in Sherwood Park and all of that could be considered historic, but they're not designated on our register. And those designations are also seen by the Historic Preservation Board, and they make a recommendation to City Council for what becomes designated.
Kristen, is there ever a what's the process of this neighborhood reversing what they want to do if they don't want to be in a historic district?
They could request to be de-designated, I suppose.
And what do you know what that would involve?
I assume it would just, going back to the Historic Preservation Board and then back to City Council to remove it from their register.
You haven't ever seen that happen.
I have not seen that happen. We have had some historic structures demolished. The ones that we have had demolished, most of them the city did, but we haven't actually even taken the formal action of taking them off the register. I suppose we should. One was the Williams House down in Dos Rios area, and one was for the construction of Riverside Parkway.
So what happens right now if we pass this? We've essentially created zone standards and a form-based district that are now everybody must apply to, no matter what. It's codified, and at that point we still have a process where it goes to this historical board, and it comes to it doesn't come to either city council or planning commission, right? It would just go to the historical board.
Just the historical board for the certificate of appropriateness applications, and then if that decision could be appealed to city council.
Okay, so the historical board is not making a recommendation to staff or a recommendation to either planning commission or city council. They're just either certifying that these criteria have been met or not. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if this doesn't go through, what is that process? If instead of saying that these are government mandated form-based requirements, if it's now the historical board still can keep these as what their guidelines would be, and instead they provide a recommendation to staff, or let me not speculate on how it would work. How does it work if we do not make every property fit into this set of criteria?
I guess I don't see that as part of your decision to what you're not calling them historic. That's already been done. This is right. An overlay basically to the properties that are within this area. So you're not being asked.
That's the root of my question. What is the difference between how it works now versus how it would work if we recommended approval of this? Is it just that there are now specific criteria that must be met by everybody, but if we don't approve this, what
The
happens?
specific criteria that would apply is only our zoning and development code for the zone districts of R4 and R5 in this area. There are no other guidelines and standards or anything relevant to this area. It's just they're straight zoned areas.
And no
I'm sorry, Keith, go ahead.
No processes get triggered in the event of somebody wants to scrape it and build some new modern home. But in the event that somebody wanted to provide multifamily or some of the other uses that are currently allowed by the underlying zone, that would still trigger site plan and an approval process for those. Is that correct? That there's nothing?
Yeah, that's correct. Because these guidelines and standards don't really address the process that they go through, except for the certificate of appropriateness. But if there are underlying land development permits that are required, then they also do those.
Chairman Teske and Commissioner Ellers, if I may add a little bit too, and maybe one of the big differentiations here, and Keith, I think you've called them kind of form-based, but the standards that Lincoln Park is proposing here are largely architectural standards. There are some basic kind of massing and obviously relationships between accessory units and the main building, but they're mostly architectural standards, and we do not have architectural standards in this area or any other residential area. So that to me is a really big difference, I think, to kind of sink the teeth into when you think about how it might exist as it does today versus should you add this layer of standard and guidelines for this district.
Can I rephrase just for one more feedback here from you, Chris? Here's my fear, right? This is where my come from is on these questions. That by approving these very specific criteria, that you are forcing a private property owner into a certain set of expenses, a certain relinquishment of their choices to somebody else for things that they may not want. And while I recognize that if the intent is to have this particular area generally look historical, put me at ease that those concerns aren't warranted here, because all I see is money and I see somebody else deciding what I get to do with my property. Am I looking through a filter of some sort?
I think you're correct in that, but in this case, these property owners are asking for it. They're wanting the city to adopt these. And so they're taking it upon themselves that these restrictions are going to be applied to my property. They will be tracked in title work as you know, for each property that's in the district. Buyers will know that it's a historic structure, that you're supposed to, you know, you will have to comply to these. Yeah, if they were looking citywide, I think those would be big concerns, and they may still be. There'll still be some neighbors that appear at the public hearings opposed to it, but the neighbors feel confident that they have a majority of the owners that want this and want to see these be taken upon by the property owners. So I don't.
Help me understand, because I heard you say that the property owners want this, and then I heard you say that the majority of the property owners want this. Are there people in there that don't want it? And if so, can you give an idea of what that proportion of opposition would be? 5%, 2 houses, or 30%?
I don't know for certain a percent, but when I was at their neighborhood meetings, they collectively made the decision, we want to move forward with this. And they felt there was some dissension, questions about, well, what if I want to enlarge my bathroom and I need to add square footage? But those things just are not once we answered those questions that you still would be able to do that, then they were okay with it. And yeah, I mean, I can't speak for all the neighbors out there. There, like I said, there may still be some that come forward that they're opposed to it, but I have not heard that from the neighborhood myself.
Kristen, Keith, I don't know if you're done, but I have a question relating to your questions. What is there an appeal process? So that if I realize that if someone bought after this was in place, if it's passed by council, they would be noticed prior to purchasing. What about those people that are disenfranchised, don't want this, and if it goes into effect and they wanted to make a change to their property, is there an appeal process of them to the Historic Society Board? Or is there an appeal process?
An appeal that it doesn't apply to them?
Yeah. Or, I mean, is there any appeal process?
Chairman Teskey, Commissioners Gastos, if I can respond to that. I think the question is what do they do if they don't like it?
Yeah.
And I think that's frankly the purpose of the public hearings, right? And the notice that goes out to the neighbors is to make sure that they're not disenfranchised, that they know that they have a voice, and that they know that there's opportunity to speak either for or against it. So, and it's obviously the process here. They've already been through the Historic Preservation Board, so that was one opportunity. And at that point in time, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we heard any opposition when it was scheduled, discussed at the Historic Preservation Board. But there will certainly be opportunity here at the Planning Commission as you guys provide a recommendation and review, and then certainly again at City Council before or if it's considered for adoption. So that's really the process. Once they're in, in theory, you could reverse all those steps if there was, I think, a large group of property owners that were uncomfortable or did not like how it was applied over time. We've certainly not experienced that. The Historic Preservation Board administers this process for the North Historic District, and I would say by and large, people support the work and frankly have not had the type of issues I think that have been expressed as concern. But every neighborhood's a little bit different, so I also want to be cognizant of that.
Sure. So what I'm hearing, Tamara, is once it's passed by council as an ordinance, it's a done deal. There's no appeal unless for a bunch of people want to get out of it.
Yeah, it would be appealed like any other ordinance that would be passed. I mean, it can certainly go through the court process, but that's rare to see that. But certainly the public hearing process is the time that we certainly ask people to come out and let us know, and let more specifically know what their feelings or interests are in the proposed regulation.
Kristen, how many meetings have they had during this 2-year process?
Well, that I attended, they had an initial one. First of all, but it wasn't necessarily about this. They had an initial one just to decide whether they wanted to become a registered neighborhood or not. Then once they decided they did that, they registered as a neighborhood that was recognized by City Council. Then they had another meeting to talk about, well, what about this? What do we want to try to provide some protection of our historic structures in our district? And that they had, like I said, they had dissension, they had questions. Can I do this? Will I be able to do this? And then there was a consensus at that meeting that was attended probably by, I would say, 30 to 40% of the property owners. And they said that, yes, we want to move ahead and try to do this next step of adopting guidelines and standards. Then they had another meeting, and I think they will probably go over this with you at the Planning Commission hearing. I think they had another meeting where they basically had large boards on the walls and gave everybody a sticker, and you vote yes or no? Do you want these to be guidelines, to standards? What's most important to you? And got a reading from the neighborhood of which ones, should we take forward as guidelines? Which one do we want to be standards? Do we want to even address color of paint, things like that? And so they got very good guidance, I think, from that meeting. Again, I think they had a good turnout there. And then they sort of chose this working group of neighbors. It was probably 10 to 12, 14 members that were willing to do the work and write these. And that group met probably, I really don't know how often they met. They met a lot. I met with them twice, and they've come to the Historic Preservation Board. They received some input from our legal department, from me, from the board members. So it's been hashed out quite a bit before
Pretty
getting to this
extensive
point.
process. Pretty extensive process.
It was extensive. And then I asked them, I said, before we take this forward to Planning Commission, and we want to have a good reading from the neighborhood that you really feel confident that the neighborhood supports it. So they sent it out in its so-called final version to every neighbor, and let people know that, what do you think? And they didn't get much of a response, but the response they got was fairly positive. So they've moved forward.
Well, I think what your point is, and Tamara's point is that it's mainly to preserve the historical area as historical. That's why they're asking for this.
Yeah, and in looking at it myself, it's not a true hard and fast historic preservation ordinance by any means. I mean, there are places like Telluride where you cannot tear down an outhouse because it's part of the historic district. And they just, the way we've approached it here in Grand Junction is that, if the neighborhood wants it, the neighborhoods have wanted it, but only if they still are allowed to do some modifications. So they're not precluding any changes to the properties. It's just trying to protect what those changes look like.
I have a couple thoughts. So I agree with Keith. I'm really concerned about infringing on people's personal property rights. This could also, and being a real estate agent, could also play out later when somebody's going to try to sell their home, and that could actually cause some restriction. Let me say, restrict the buyer pool, so to speak, because there would be certain requirements on a property. My other concern is we have a lot of elderly people that live downtown, and I personally wouldn't feel comfortable moving forward until we actually heard from every single person that lived in that area. Because if something happens with those properties, I'm guessing it will probably go on to, a trust or children that will have to end up dealing with a property. And if it was unbeknownst to them what was required with these properties, I guess I just have some hesitation. I do appreciate what you're saying as far as it doesn't sound super restrictive. It just seems to me that I don't want to be restricting people's personal property rights. And I love the history and the historic look of downtown. I actually own some homes down there, so I can appreciate that aspect of it. I just want to tread really lightly that we're, like he said, not requiring certain things that are going to then require dollars from someone that they may or may not have because there's certain standards in place. And I just would like to hear from I would want every single neighbor to have a vote yes or no on it. I know there can be a majority, but that will tend to be, again, is that the majority of people of the homes that have showed up, or is that just we've had a certain group of people show up? Because those who are interested are going to be the ones that show up or the ones that know about it. I know that sometimes people miss seeing things, but those are just kind of my thoughts. And again, if those can be, I guess, calmed a little bit, then maybe it would be okay. But it just makes me a little bit concerned.
An alternative that I see to this is those who want to participate in it create this district. And if they want to come forward and put these criteria on, and that's what that looks like, then hey, I've got a lot more to think about if I'm going to be resistant to it. And then as those neighbors who don't want to be part of it right now, either choose to sell or decide, you know what, maybe it's not that bad, they can always be added in at a later time through an amendment process. It's real simple. And if those that do control the majority want control over those properties from those who are dissenting, then they have options as well, such as buy them, own them, or choose into it. And that's beyond just the theoretical, because this happens on a daily basis with our conservation land trusts. They don't just get to go out and designate things in certain ways. As lands come up that they deem valuable for what their enjoyment and their priorities are, they've generated the resources to acquire those through a number of different mechanisms. And I'd rather see that approach here than a group forcing this upon those who want to dissent, especially when it's in the scenario like this where they can get at it on later. There's not a downside. If there's those who don't want to be there, letting them continue to use the property in the manner that they purchased it and those systems that are in place right now, it's not going to destroy the neighborhood, in my opinion. And of course, we get into the debate about the difference between compatibility and being the same. So I understand that's subjective, but that's I'll stop at this point. I really wanted to reiterate that for me, if any owner is being brought into these standards who has not said, yes, I want to be, then I can't, I'm resistant and would need to be talked off that ledge.
Chairman Teskey, Commissioner Ehlers, I think what we've heard today is good feedback. The city is not the applicant on this one, so we will certainly convey what we've heard to the degree we're able to the applicants for the request. And hopefully that will help them prepare for the conversation on Tuesday with you all. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, so I did want to do a chime check. I think we have until 1:30 on the calendar, but just wanted to make sure those that are with us are able to stay till 1:30. Excellent. So Chairman Teskey, if we may, we wanted to also highlight for you a number of the code text amendments that we are planning on bringing forth to you next week. So I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, who also has this agenda item.
Hey, did I do this one right? Are you seeing the presentation? No? Yes?
Still no.
No.
Still no?
Still
Okay,
no.
I didn't do it. Still didn't do it right. Swap presenter, is that right?
Hit escape.
I thought I did it. Oh,
So you have to hit this button first
I did.
and zoom with the hip share screen.
Okay. Thought you did that part.
Mhm. And then
There we go.
But that's the wrong one. Where's my other one? Disappeared.
here, can I see it?
Yeah.
And then this one?
Yeah.
And
I did that part.
yeah. Okay, you're good now.
Okay. Now we see it. All right. So as Tamara said, we've got a number of zoning and development code amendments coming to you. Wouldn't consider any of them really very major, but some cleaning up and some clarification and getting rid of some redundancies and conflicts in the code. So I'll just start running through them one by one here. The first one is accessory uses in structures and fences. They're currently addressed in the code that the location, setback, and height of fences are addressed, and that we did amend some of our other fence standards in 2019 so that any variations from standard fence requirements could be approved by the director via the administrative adjustment process. But then we found that this one part, there was still this sentence in here that says fences meeting principal structures shall not exceed 8 feet in height without a special permit. And this one really should have been changed with the 2019 amendments to allow this to also be a director's decision. So the proposal is to just strike the sentence, this last sentence in the fencing requirements. Any questions on that one? There are 2 sections of the code that address the type of notice to the general public for a final plat and subdivision application. The general notice standards are in this table here. And then, however, there's also in another section, this one that says notice of a final plat is not required. But yet in the table, it says that that there is notice required. So we want to maintain the table as it is and strike the other portion of the code that says it is not required. Questions on that?
Yeah, where does it say in that table that you're showing that final plat has a notice requirement?
Subdivisions, that's a final plat. Subdivision there is notice within 500 feet and there's a sign placed on the property.
Oh, okay. So after preliminary approval is given and then final approval for the subdivision is done, then there has to be another notice for final plat.
Well, the final plat and plan pretty much used interchangeably. I mean, preliminary, yeah, there is, if you go through the preliminary process there, that's a different notice. But this one, yeah, for both the final and the preliminary, it requires it. We would want it to require both.
Oh, I maybe I'm getting hung up. So after you get your final approval and now some developers would choose not to just run down and file the plat or anything like that. They can hang on to that. Then if they get 6 months down the road and they want to record the plat, they don't have to notify or go through something there. Right?
No, this is just notice of when there is an application for the plat process.
Okay, and that
is not those. It's not for filing of the final plat. Is for application to our department for a subdivision final plat that there is public notice given.
Yeah, thanks. I was overthinking that one.
So Kristen, just a question following up with Keith. What has changed?
We're striking this second line here that says that it's not required because it conflicts with the table. It's in a different section that says it is required.
So you've shown us both of those things there.
Yes.
Okay. So you're going to keep what's in yellow.
We're trying to, yes.
And,
that's
and then is that sufficient for the code to I guess it is.
Yeah.
If you strike that sentence.
Then there's not 2 conflicting sections anymore.
I see.
In our code.
But it still has, because it's in the chart, it has a requirement.
Yes. Let's see. The next one here that's in the red, the home occupation standards the home occupation section does have performance standards that are shown here of in the different zone districts, what kind of standards you have to meet in each zone district. And number 9 states the storage of goods and materials shall be inside and shall not include flammable, combustible, or explosive materials other than those customary to household uses. And you can see that it currently has a Y in every zone district except for R1. So This seems to staff to just be an inadvertent, it was inadvertently left out in the R1 zone district, because if you have to meet this requirement for home occupation in RR, RE, and all the other zone districts above R1, it seems like it should apply in R1 as well. So we're just adding a Y for yes, it applies in R1 for the storage of those sorts of things.
Well, I'm impressed with the staff picking that up.
Yeah, you know, and it probably maybe could have just been done with the Scrivener's error correction, but we're taking it through as an amendment to the code. So this one is regarding building size. You can see in the chart that we have maximum building size given for the RO and B1 districts. And we do not have a definition of building size in our code at all. So the proposal here is to change that to gross floor area, for which we do have a definition, so that at least we know what that means. But we're also wanting or proposing to add a note to this table that in the RO and B1, where there is a maximum gross floor area, that it not include these items listed here: eaves, covered or uncovered porches, upper story decks and balconies, breezeways, stairwells, and decorative walls less than 3 feet in height. That what we calculate as gross floor area would exclude those things. This will help in some design of buildings, in that they can maximize their square footage, but if they want to have a balcony, say off of an apartment building, they could at least provide that amenity and that make it the building actually look better, but it not be included in the gross floor area. So we're just proposing to, first of all, change it to gross floor area, and then add this note as to what is not included in gross floor area in those two zone districts.
Hey, Kristen, on that note, the first note underneath that highlighted area, B1, max building size varies. Is that another max building note that needs to be adjusted for those same reasons?
Yes, Lance just brought that one to me today. I will be amending that. It should say max gross floor area. Propose the change there as well in the B1.
That was a good catch,
Yeah.
Keith.
It's the inner nerd in me.
Lance
Can't get enough of this planning stuff.
Yeah. So we will be proposing in the ordinance to change both in both places. So,
Kristen, if I may, I just have a question about how this cross references with building or fire code calculations of a similar nature. Is there going to be a issue there?
I don't believe so, because the building or the fire and building don't have this limitation on size. It's just our limitation on size of buildings in these zone districts. It makes sense to allow these sorts of things to be added to the building without being part of that maximum. But I don't believe fire and building really address maximum, so I don't think there's any conflict there with them.
Okay.
So there's another one that we kind of on the use zone table here. This is our use zone matrix that has all of the zone districts listed and where you can have a manufactured or mobile home park. And currently the only zone districts that allow these by conditional use permit are R5, R8, and R12. And in considering these, when you're looking at a manufactured housing park, it really is not, the type of development is not that different than a single family home development or multifamily home development that you could have in R5, R8, and R12. And so as a means of trying to promote this is a very important affordable housing product that we have. And so instead of requiring the conditional use permit, making them allowed uses because they really are not that unlike what could already be developed as a stick-built subdivision in R5, R8, and R12, or subdivision or development. Okay, any questions on that one?
I may have one at the risk of it getting sideways, but with tiny homes, this, and I'm air quoting, I suppose, when I say tiny homes, being an element that is part of the development conversation these days, that they're smaller units and potentially they can be more dense. Is there a good reason, and tiny homes could, in some definitions, and many, be fit under a manufactured housing park, for example. Is there a reason to not be given any options within the R16 zone and potentially the R24 as well?
I don't know the answer to that, but I think that with tiny homes, I'm not sure, and even R12 somewhat, I'm not sure that you can attain that density of R16
right.
anyway.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Sure. Chairman Teskey, Commissioner Zellers, I think that's a great question. I think we're generally in a mindset where we want to remove the barriers to a variety of different housing products. And I guess I would look to you if that's a suggestion, if you will, to add an A to that box. We haven't done kind of the back of the napkin calculations to see if it will work, but it might. And so that may be an opportunity you guys want to allow in that R16. And I think we would, at least in concept, be supportive, even in absence of knowing whether that's a buildable product. But you're absolutely correct. Most communities, when they look at tiny home developments, will put them in this category.
I think Chris hit on it. I mean, the question is, are we going to go make this an allowable use in here without knowing if it's even feasible? But then I can swing to the other side and say, it's not our job to decide if it's feasible. What about tiny homes in an R16? Wouldn't we like that would make us say, no, let's leave that off? Is that a conversation for now, or is that maybe a different?
I think it might be for later, because now that I look more at this, and we're saying, well, these aren't unlike R5, R8, R12. Well, then are they any different than one of those that you can do in a C1 or an RO? And so maybe there are more zone districts that we need to look at as allowing this type of housing product. But I think that's a different conversation. But
it could be, and maybe let's make that note, but I would advocate to not throw this one out and wait for it. We can keep this within the current batch that we're looking at here, and then consider additional, widening of that allowance at a later date.
okay. Let's see, then we've got one regarding zero lot line. Presently, the code here that's shown says current code, and it's stricken. It does not permit window openings of any kind on walls within 3 feet of a property line. And this provision, the way it's written now, precludes any design flexibility to allow for some windows or natural lighting on those sides of a home, especially for someone who may be wanting to do a zero lot line. And then as we had more discussions with Mesa County Building Department and some of our local development community about this, found that this was in conflict with what the building code allows and what fire code allows. So we're proposing language to be consistent with the county code in this regard, and to allow that there could be some window openings or other openings for light on a wall that is within 3 feet of a property line. And as long as it still meets building and fire codes, I believe if they are within 3 feet, there are certain fire codes of what those windows are made out of. But at least allowing the design opportunity to put some sort of windows on that wall. and be consistent with building codes as it is.
And if I just may clarify, Chris, we're not dealing with the Mesa County's codes. It is the city who's actually adopted the building and the fire code. So this is trying to make it consistent with our own code.
Well, it's actually more consistent with how it reads in the Mesa County Zoning and Development Code also.
And that may be, but we're trying to cover those things which are requirements of the city too.
Yeah, so, but the recommendation from building and department is look at the wording that the county has in their zoning code. Because that was updated fairly recently, and I think they worked on this concern then, so. Any questions on that one? Historic Preservation Board. This one is regarding the composition of the board, which currently reads that one member of the board has to be from the Downtown Development Authority Board or an employee of the Downtown Development Authority. And at the time our code was written, our Historic Preservation Ordinance was written largely by the DDA. They wanted this in the code. But now that the DDA is sort of headed in other directions with their creative district and working on other things, while historic preservation is important to them, they feel like they want to relinquish their requirement for having somebody on the board. So this is just deleting that portion of the composition of the board that we not require a DDA member. Any questions on that one? Pretty straightforward. The mixed use and industrial standards here that are summarized in this big table. Right now, as you'll see, there's a lot of areas where it says NA, not applicable or something. We're not sure what. So what we're trying to do is replace the NAs with a more specific number of really what we feel the intent of the NA was, whether it's none, whether it's 100%, or defining something else that makes more sense, which we did in the abutting residential side yard there. We did actually define some number there instead of just saying NA. So there's a number of lines here that when you look at it, you'll see where we've replaced it with either the 100% or with the none, or with a number, and just to try to make this more clear for us implementing it, as well as the development community trying to work with our development standards.
How come on the side setback, it used to be, okay, I'm looking here in I2, it went from not applicable to 10.
On those that we changed to an actual number, we tried to look at the consistency of, like in I2, if you have an I2 next to residential, we already had 10 required in IO and I1. So we changed it to the number that seemed most relevant to that category of land use, or that zone district.
Thanks.
Does it make sense? Sort of. Telecommunications facilities here. I don't have it highlighted in red, but it's there under the base station with non-concealed attached antennas. It was a conditional use permit in the MU zone district. And, but if you look at the C1 and BP, which are very similar districts that allow similar types of uses, they are allowed, it's an allowed use to have that sort of telecommunication facility. So the proposal here is to eliminate the conditional use permit in the MU and make it an allowed use. And that's really the only change to this table is to make that change. questions on that? Nope. Okay. I think this is kind of the last group here, the decision maker for plan amendments. The code, a lot of this has to do with the code having been written and adopted at the same time as our 2010 comprehensive plan. And so the code includes several sections and provisions that talk about the elements of the 2010 plan that really simply don't exist anymore or don't make sense now that we have our new plan. But the first one here is to clarify the applicability of plan amendments themselves, and that amendments are talking about the comprehensive plan as well as all the adopted titles within volume 3 of the comprehensive plan, which are all the other neighborhood plans and things that we've adopted, our circulation plan and those things, so that it's clear without this statement that's underlined here being added. It wasn't clear really when we talked about comprehensive plan, what were we talking about in terms of the code? And so this is trying to clarify, we're talking about all of those adopted titles under the comprehensive plan. And then in the decision making for administrative changes, the code as it's written allows the director to make some pretty significant decisions here about rezoning and comprehensive plan amendments, and you need to use adjacency, those sorts of things. But those are all addressed now. Those kinds of things are specifically addressed in our new comprehensive plan, so they are not needed here. So we're proposing to delete, as they are stricken, all of those statements and just leave the director authority to those two things of minor additions and the minor corrections.
So who does, if you go back to that, who does make the land use designation?
That's the next one, I think, the next slide. There is a specific process which that it's outlined in the Grand Junction Comprehensive Plan. And so we're changing the code just to reference the plan. And that's where those are addressed, is who makes those decisions. But I think they are Planning Commission decisions is how they are set up.
Am I understanding that correctly, that the land use designation is determining what the current land use is? Is that right? Or was this, go to the previous slide, please. Item number 3. Make land use designation changes.
Are we? Something has multiple designations, right?
Oh, okay, so that is referring to changing the map, the designations on the map then?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Tamara, but I don't think we have very many parcels now with the way our plan was adopted that have the multiple land use designations on them.
Yeah, that's correct, Chris. In fact, I believe we worked really hard to eliminate all parcels that have more than one designation. And I don't think that's 100%, but I think it's pretty darn close compared to the old one that, as you guys probably recall, things were much more amorphous with some round edges and shapes. And so that was pretty challenging sometimes to implement. And certainly those actually were never director's decisions anyway. We always took them to you all for comp plan amendments. So that was the default. So this is really just recognizing that process that we already were working with.
Right. So we are making our code consistent with the plan by referencing the plan versus trying to prescribe what the plan says in our code, because that was covered fairly well in our comprehensive plan as it was adopted. And I think that's the last one for this batch.
Kristen, that was a lot of effort on the staff's part, but I think they all look pretty good to me.
Well, they're fairly minor, but we actually do have some development that is waiting for these to happen. We have a telecommunications facility and the apartments on Grand Avenue that may take advantage of these changes after they're adopted. Hopefully adopted.
So what I'm hearing from you and Tamara is that it makes it consistent with what the new comprehensive plan is and what you've been doing all along, correct?
As far as the comprehensive plan piece of it?
Yeah, it makes it consistent with the comprehensive plan, but there hasn't been in addition, it's not a dramatic change from like, if there was some administrative decisions, not it's what we've been doing, right? But it's
That's
making
correct,
it.
George.
Okay, thank you.
Right, I think there might be some minor amendments though that maybe the director was able to do that will now come to you.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Okay, well, like the conditional use permit in those 3 zones.
Yeah, those other ones, yeah, those small ones.
Well, thank you guys. I know we're running a little bit over, so I want to be sensitive to time here. It looks like we've lost our chairman to other meetings as well. Wanted, like I said, to take the time to preview both of these for next week. They're obviously both legislative, and appreciate the comments and discussion on both of these big agenda items here. And for those that are fairly new or recently new to the Planning Commission, certainly my mantra here to try to tweak and adjust our code over time as we continue to use it and administer it and find the areas that aren't working or don't provide the degree of flexibility that either we think here as we administer it daily or as brought to our attention by the private sector as we work with them on specific projects. So all of these have been brought up over the course of time, again, either as we administer or people have specific projects. So appreciate your consideration. We try to package them up in bulk, if you will. So hopefully it's a good use of your time and we continue to refine our code as a tool for our development community here. And with that, I see Commissioner Ellers.
I have a questionable attendance for Tuesday night. I'm targeting to be there, but I may not. So if we need to have a backup, please do.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So it sounds like, Sandra, you're on deck. Perfect. Thanks for the heads up and advance notice. And if there's no other questions, we'll let you go and look forward to seeing you guys on Tuesday.